This is Joe Galloway conducting an oral history interview with Ed Doyne on Thursday, April 16th at 10:30 a.m. We're located at the television station KCPQ 13 in Seattle, Washington. Mr. Doyne, before we talk about your experiences in Vietnam, I'd like to get a little biographic information about you if I could. How old were you when you went to Vietnam?
I was 20, Joe.
20 years old.
Yes, sir.
What was your family status?
My family, my mother and father, my dad was a plumber. My mother was a housewife mother of 6. I was number 2 of 6. I had an older sister. And we had grown up in rural Muncie, Pennsylvania, a small town, and we ended up living in a place called Willingboro, New Jersey, which was one of the Levitt towns. And that's where I graduated from high school.
So that's your hometown?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
What was your sense of the Vietnam War before you entered the military?
You know, I knew it started while I was in high school, and I knew of it, but again, it was like everybody's memory. It was sort of a distant thing. It's going on way over there somewhere. I wasn't quite old enough at the time. I graduated from high school and went to college intending to be a doctor. I was at Rutgers, and I lasted a semester. Failed calculus and French. They said, you're on probation, and I said I quit, and I went home. And I got my notice to take my draft physical, and that was my sort of
wake-up call.
Wake-up call. And I said, I am not going to get drafted, and I went down to see a Marine recruiter and enlisted.
You went to Vietnam as a lieutenant, though.
I did. I spent 2 years enlisted before I got commissioned.
Okay. What did you do as an enlisted Marine?
I was a bomb humper, an aviation ordnanceman. So I loaded bombs, rockets, and missiles, helped put them together, picked them up at the bomb dump, took them to the flight line, primarily at Cherry Point, North Carolina. But I deployed once with a training unit to Yuma, Arizona.
What led you to officer candidate school?
I made sergeant, got orders to Vietnam as a bomb humper, and got orders to OCS all in the same month. And everybody said you should go to OCS first, which seemed like the logical choice to me, so that's what I did.
What sort of training did you have before you deployed?
After OCS, I went to the basic school, the Marine Corps Basic School, which I remember being about 5 or 6 months long.
Quantico? At
Quantico, and every Marine officer, actually not all the pilots at that time went through it because some of them went straight to flight training, but 99% of us, any Marine officer went through the basic school. There was no infantry officers course then like there is today. And when you graduated from basic school, you were capable of being a Marine lieutenant infantry officer. And infantry was my first choice, and magically I got that. Big surprise. And
would have probably been your selection if you had been your third choice.
Well, it was interesting because my company commander was a tanker, and he kept showing us pictures of tanks that had been blown up by big mines, and my platoon commander was an infantry officer, and he kept saying, no, you don't want to be in one of those iron coffins. And you know, I had grown up playing war and army, so I was sort of, you know, drawn to the infantry.
Tell me about your first arrival in Vietnam. How did you get there?
I left Travis Air Force Base in a civilian 707, and I don't remember how many seats there were, but every seat on the plane was a second lieutenant from my class. with the exception of one captain and one first lieutenant that I think they put in there to kind of keep an eye on us. But it was, we had 2 companies graduate from basic school at the same time.
And they were all rendezvoused at
Travis and got on that plane and went.
A plane full of Marine lieutenants.
Yep. We were,
boggles the mind.
We were the Commandant's Christmas gift to the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions, I think. So, you know, we landed in Da Nang, and it was the same thing where you wonder whether you're going to be shot at or mortared while you're landing, and it was just perfectly calm. Got off the plane, got into trucks, and they sorted us 1st and 3rd Division. 3rd Division guys went and got on another plane and went up north, and the rest of us were taken up to what then was called Freedom Hill, where the Division CP was.
In Da Nang.
In Da Nang. Mm-hmm.
And that was your initial assignment.
Exactly, right. You reported into division, and they actually, I have a picture of like 20 of us sitting in bleachers in our raincoats because it was raining, and they sorted us into, they processed our orders, and then they said, you guys are going to the 1st Marines, you get on this truck. You're going to the 7th Marines, you get on this truck. They divided people up, and off we went in the back of a 6x.
Ah. And you were assigned to what?
I originally was assigned to 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and was a platoon commander in Delta Company.
And what was your daily routine as a platoon commander?
When I first reported in and got oriented, my platoon was spread out across a large portion of our sector in just squad-sized positions. And so I was kind of like a circuit rider. I would go out and visit each one of the squads, spend some time with them, in some cases spend the night with them, and you know, get to know the Marines. And our job then really was to keep the rockets out of Da Nang. And there was a big, basically a ring of patrols and combat bases that were just beyond the range of 140 millimeter rockets. And
now, what month and year is this?
This was December of '68.
'68. Mm-hmm. What were your living conditions like?
When we were in the rear, we lived in plywood hooches that had corrugated metal roofs and screen, kind of like I think almost everybody did in Vietnam for the most part. When you're out in the bush, you were sleeping on whatever you had.
Hole in the ground.
Hole in the ground, and you know, your poncho liner sometimes laying in the mud of a rice paddy.
What responsibilities consume most of your time?
Most of the time, I think it was training and preparing. We were getting ready for a company-size operation. This was right after Operation Meade River had been fought down in Dodge City. And the battalion's mission was to send a company down into Dodge City at a time and try and keep it secure so that the VC and NVA couldn't move back in there.
What were your impressions of the Vietnamese people? Did you have much contact?
We did, in that, first of all, most of the squad positions were based with popular forces platoons, so not unlike our National Guard.
Right. Militia guys.
Exactly. So when I can remember one of my infamous meals was being out with the squad one night, and they said, "Sir, you really should go eat with the Vietnamese. They want to have you eat with them." And so I went over, and they had this pot of chicken, and I didn't see them prepare it. And we sat down and we started to eat, and I realized that it was chicken that was just full of bones, and I could hear them crunching, and they were eating bones and all. And I was just like, I don't know how I can do this. So I was picking the chicken off the bones and eating it. But that was the last time I think that I ate with the Vietnamese, the whole year and a half that I was there.
And my thought is, you assumed that was chicken.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, I didn't see it captured on the hoof. Good point.
If it didn't have a beak, you may have been eating a kitty cat.
Or a dog. That's very true.
Dog.
Yep.
Describe your friendships with and your impressions of your fellow Marines.
You know, over the years, I'm still in contact with a lot of the Marines that I served with in Vietnam. It's taken a long time for us to get back together, but those are relationships, as you know, that you never forget. And you know, my platoon sergeant, my first platoon sergeant, when we rebuilt the platoon that I took over later in my tour, is down in Texas, and in the middle of nowhere in Texas, and I wish I could go down and see him like once a month and support him. One of my radio operators is actually in San Antonio, and he sees him as often as he can, but the gunny's getting up there in years and, you know, needs help, and you wish you could reach out and help those guys.
Yeah. Did you form friendships with men from different racial and social backgrounds during your time in the Corps that you might not have had as a civilian?
There's no doubt about that. I think the Marine Corps, all the services really, but the Marine Corps especially then, was a melting pot. There was racial tension at different times. The beauty of it is, I think, that when you were out in the bush, there was none. You were together and you worked together. A lot of things that are dramatized, I think, in movies are really kind of a false impression, at least from my perspective, the war that I saw. It doesn't, at the time, now it's maybe politically incorrect to say this, but the first sergeant was almost always preaching, there are no white Marines, there are no black Marines, there are only green Marines.
They're green Marines.
And he literally had a kid with paint, you know, green and yellow paint on his hands from dipping rocks in the paint to make this little border thing, to make it really clear. So yeah, it really did bridge across all kinds of both socioeconomic and racial lines.
You think that was a healthy thing?
I do. I think, you know, in a lot of cases, from boot camp and officers candidate school, basic school, and then in Vietnam itself, you found that you're getting to know people and working with people that you maybe never would have come in contact with had you not gone in the service.
I don't know if you had any, but what did you do for recreation or off-duty time?
That's a good question, and I was thinking about this. When you were in the field, when you're in the bush, even as a platoon commander, company commander, when I was the executive officer of the company in the rear, there really wasn't a lot of recreational time. You were always interacting with troops and being a leader. But when you did have free time, it was, you know, writing letters home or making tapes that you sent home. Later, when I extended, after my year was up, I extended for another 6 months, and I was at the wing headquarters. And there we were living in old French barracks that had air conditioning. And I can remember being the guy who didn't play cards, so I was making popcorn while a bunch of lawyers and other guys who were in the same BOQ were playing cards. They'd be playing cards in the room and had a refrigerator, and you know, that was the great life there.
That's pretty good living.
It was good living. Yeah, it was.
Do you have any specific memories of the popular culture, music, books, film, from your time there? Is there a song that pops into your head and brings it all back? Yeah,
you know, I'm a big 60s music fan, and almost anything from the 60s brings it back. But I think the biggest song, and my guess is it's probably in your head too, is "We Got to Get Out of This Place."
We got to get out of this place.
Last thing we ever do. Yeah, and to be honest, I'm never good at remembering who did what songs. I think that might have been the Doors, but I don't know. But it's always there in your mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Leaving on a jet plane was another one.
Yeah. Yep. Your area of operations was entirely in that Da Nang corridor?
Exactly. We worked from just north of Hoi An, where the Republic of Korean Marines were, up to the Haivan Pass.
Right.
And
Know it well.
they were in different places at different times. When I was at the division headquarters, I could see that we went down into the Arizona territory where the 7th Marines were while I was there, and up into the Haivan Pass, the 26th Marines who were up further north, protecting the roads up to the DMZ.
Right. Can you describe significant actions that you participated in, combat operations, that sort of thing?
Most of the time I was there, I got there after Mead River. Most of the time I was there was labeled Operation Pipestone Canyon, I think. I remember very well the 21st day that I was in country when I got wounded and medevaced, and I remember several other times. All seemed to focus around Dodge City.
Tell me about the day you were wounded.
You know, we all, I think anybody who came back from the war who was in combat wonders why they came back and their cousin or their friend or whoever didn't. And I still have not answered that question today, but I brought something with me that might be a good show and tell thing after. I was standing up in the open. This is the perfect second lieutenant idiot story. It was at the end of the day. We'd been on a company size operation, standing up in the open. We'd only been shot at like 2 or 3 times before that during that day on this sweep. At one point we brought in an airstrike, and it was a pair of Phantoms, and because I had loaded bombs and rockets on Phantoms, and you know, I was all excited about it, and I remember being up cheering when this guy was dropping the bombs. My radio operator grabbed me and pulled me down, said, "Lieutenant, if you don't stay behind this log, you're liable to get a piece of that shrapnel in your head." And so later that day, as we were getting ready to set in, I was talking to the company commander on the radio. I had my map and compass in this hand. I'm standing up in the open. The radio operator's back behind me. And I turned around to hand the handset back to the radio operator. And as I did, as I recall, there were 2 shots fired. One of them went through my arm. Another one hit one of the Arvins who was with us on the operation in his arm, oddly enough. It went through my arm, came out this side, went through my flak jacket, went through my notebook, platoon commander's notebook that was in my pocket. It busted the tip of my pen, ripped it all up. It cut a hole in my chest right at the bottom of my heart and fell down into my trousers. Now, I didn't realize the last part of that story until the next day.
Really?
But I'm probably messing up the audio here. But I remember coming to, not being knocked out, but realizing where I was laying on the ground. And I looked down at my arm, and it was as big around as my leg. I mean, literally, it just instantly blew up like that from the trauma.
And it broken the bone?
It chipped the bones. It went between them. You know, this was all, to me, it's a miracle story. So it chipped the bones. And I looked down, and I could see blood spurting out. So there was at least one artery that was cut. And the corpsman is hollering, "Anybody hurt?" And it was like, "Yeah, me, you know, why me?" So corpsman crawled over. This kid's name was Doc Applegarth, who I've never seen since. This was in 1-1, Delta 1-1. And as he's putting a battle dressing on my arm, he said, "You know, sir, you're my first casualty." And it was just like, why me, you know? But he patched me up, and it was because it was getting late. We didn't want to bring in a helicopter at night, and so both of us were, you know, okay to spend the night. We decided, so I stayed out there, and there was we got set in, and the company commander called the platoon commanders up. So I sort of staggered back down into the mortar pits, and had one of the mortarmen take me to the company CP, and we had a platoon commanders meeting, and while I was there was some fire taken at our side of the perimeter. And the company commander said, get a grid on where that was and we'll put some harassing and interdiction fires, H&I fires we called them, on that area. So when I went back, I called my squad leaders up and I said, where'd that fire come from? And, you know, give me a grid, and whoever it was said, I don't have anything to write on. So I reached in my pocket and I pulled out my notebook to hand it to him, and he just handed it back to me, and there's a bullet hole through the middle of it.
Uh-oh.
And I pulled out my pen, and the whole tip of the pen was just shredded. And I put the pen in my cargo pocket on my trousers, left the notebook laying out there, and it's still out there someplace rusting in Dodge City. But the pen literally...
You got it.
I got it. And oddly enough, I got this from the life insurance agent. He was a Navy captain who was selling us life insurance at basic school. So I don't know how well you can see it against that background.
It worked out good then.
It literally helped save my life. It was pretty amazing.
But the notebook is out there on the battlefield.
Somewhere. You know, and I was worried about that for a long time, that it had addresses and stuff in it, you know, and that I would somehow end up, you know, getting somebody in trouble back home. But you know, you don't know why. You know, if I hadn't turned around, if I had turned a little further, it might have missed me.
Yeah.
So I could have been luckier, but I still think I'm a pretty lucky guy.
Now, go ahead with the story of your evacuation.
So the next morning, the sun came up, and I got up, and the first thing you have to do when you wake up out in the field is go take a leak someplace. And so I walked over into some rubble, and when I reached up and grabbed my trousers, I felt something go down my pants. And I called over one of the other platoon commanders and asked him to open up the blousing garter, you know, the thing that you use to keep leeches and stuff out of your pants. And somehow it fell out into the dirt. We never found the round.
It was the round that hit you, though.
As near as we could tell, yeah. I still didn't think about my chest, and nobody looked at it. So helicopter came in, 46 and the medevaced us both back to the 1st Medical Battalion in Da Nang. And they took me in and laid me on the operating table, and it was just a big steel ice-cold table. And so I'm laying there, and the guy takes my hand, and he's got it up in the air like this. He's holding my arm up, and they stick a needle in my armpit and inject a anesthetic that put the nerves to sleep. Blocked it, exactly. When he let go of my hand, it fell down like it was a rubber band. But in my head, it was still up there. You know, your brain didn't get that blockage. And so they start scrubbing on my arm, and they cut off my flak jacket and my utility jacket, my T-shirt, and the guy went, look, he's got all this black stuff on his chest. And we thought it was the impact of the round hitting the flak jacket, but it turned out it was the ink from the pen. And so they started scrubbing this bullet hole, which is literally over my ribs right at the bottom of my heart. And there was no anesthetic there. It hurt like hell. That was probably hurt more than anything, but all it was just enough of a cut to leave a scar. So that was, you know.
Mighty lucky fella.
I wonder every day, at least once a day, you know, why I'm here and what it is I'm supposed to be doing that caused me to still be alive.
The man upstairs wanted you for something.
Yes, sir.
Now, what they do, they evacuate you?
So I spent, you spend like 3 or 4 days getting stabilized at the medical battalion, and then if you have a wound that's gonna take a while to heal, they wanted to evacuate you out of country so it didn't get infected. And so I flew on a 141, C-141 Air Force Aerovac plane to Guam, and I spent a month in the hospital in Guam, and this was $1 million wound. You know, I got up every day and went to physical therapy in my pajamas, and then put on civilian clothes and went out and sat around a swimming pool someplace at a club. And
did they do any surgery on your arm?
No, they basically just debrided the wound in Da Nang and
bandaged it up.
Bandaged it up and said, "There you go." And it was interesting because everybody you talk to, you have the ability to take your thumb and stick it on the outside of your little finger. And the doctor in Guam said, you're not leaving here until you can do that with this hand. And I would still be sitting in Guam in the hospital trying to get that finger
trying to make it
to go outside. The little finger doesn't rotate anymore. And I got a twitch in my arm, in my hand when I try and write something, so my signature looks like terrible, and I type everything I can. But you know,
Were you left-handed?
I was left-handed, so I wrote the first letter home to my mother with my right hand, printed it, and someplace I still have that. It was
your mother get the telegram?
She got the telegram. I got that in an old scrapbook. She got the telegram.
Scared her to death.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember. I think a recruiter actually went to the door early on in the war, before there were too many casualties. I think they actually sent somebody, even for somebody who was wounded. But the letter that I sent from First Med got there almost the same time. It was the mail coming out of Vietnam. Apparently that day was really straight
fast.
back to New Jersey really fast.
Wow.
So I was a lucky guy.
You were a lucky guy. You recuperated in Guam and then were sent back to Vietnam.
I did. You could stay a month basically, and then there was concerns about combat pay and everything. So at the end of that month, I went back through Okinawa and back into Da Nang. And the personnel officer at the division said, "I'm not sending you back to the bush now, because we've spent so much money training you and getting you here. If you get wounded one more time," it was called a 48. If you're out of action for 48 hours twice, then they had to send you home. So he said, "I'm keeping you here, and I'm going to get some good out of you." So I spent about 3 months as a watch officer in the Combat Operations Center, which meant there was a staff NCO, a staff non-commissioned officer, a gunnery sergeant usually, and a first or second lieutenant. Most of them were first lieutenants who had rotated out of the bush. And that was where the division actually ran the war from. All the reports and stuff that came up from
into that
all the units came in there. So it was a great experience for me as a second lieutenant, because I got to see what they wanted. You know, what were the answers to the questions that they kept asking us, you know, when we're out in the field. And I was there at the division when what was called ASP-1, I think, blew up, an ammunition supply point, which is right on the other side of what was Freedom Hill, a big ridge line that the division was built into. There was in essence, a big, huge ammo dump.
Big ammo dump. I think they blew that thing up 3 or 4 times during the war.
Right. When I was there, it started with a fire, and I was in the COC. I'd come back from briefing the ARVNs, the Vietnamese commander downtown in the morning. The guy was coming off watch. I came back and debriefed in the Combat Operations Center, and then it was okay. Now, you know, I was going to go hit the rack and sleep for a couple hours. And the gunny got a spot report and said, they got a fire down at Freedom Hill, down near the PX, but they think Shore Party can handle it, not a problem. And I went down and went to sleep, and the next thing I knew, my rack was just vibrating. You know, it was booming. My cot was bumping off the floor. And it was raining dirt. I got pictures of the dirt that came down out of the sky from all the stuff that was blown up in the air.
Wow.
One of the guys who I had been with at Cherry Point, I think, got a Navy Marine Corps life-saving medal for going out into the middle of that with a power wagon, an old Dodge power wagon,
yeah.
Drove out into one of the magazines, got a bunch of the guys who were working out there, and then hightailed it out. Whoa. So I think it was Staff Sergeant Chase.
What was your most vivid memory of your tour in Vietnam?
I think it was probably getting shot. the other thing was when I got notified that my cousin, who was in India Company in 3-1, when I left the division, I went back to the 1st Marines, and I was in 3rd Battalion 1st Marines in Kilo Company, and my cousin from Pennsylvania was in India Company.
Same battalion.
Same battalion, and
wow.
we never saw each other, because one of us was always out in the field then. But while I was at division, I'd gone down to the battalion and visited him. And we got
Was he an officer as
pictures.
well?
No, he was a Lance Corporal.
Lance Corporal.
Lance Corporal. And his name was Bill Merle. And he was on a combat patrol, and somebody set off what they think was then a command detonated. Today we call them IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Then we called them SFDs, surprise firing devices.
Yeah.
But it was basically the same thing. This was an artillery round. They thought it would, from the size, it was a 175 round.
Whoa.
175 millimeter, which is a big shell.
Big shell.
And it killed he and his squad leader, I think it was, and wounded several of the other Marines. And a guy I had been with at basic school, who was his platoon commander, came over and called me out of the company CP, where I was the executive officer. And we kind of walked over toward the chapel, and he said, "I got to tell you," and he told me that my cousin had been killed.
This affect you?
I mean, it always does. It was a trauma for the whole family. It still is. My niece wanted me, like 2 years ago, I was going to work over in Nepal, just north of India, and one of my nieces, his sister, said, "I want to go with you and go to Vietnam." We go back to Vietnam. She said, "I need to get closure." I mean, this is 40 years after this happened. Her mother died. Her father and her mother both died. Her mother just died recently. With that ache in your heart that you feel when you lose a child.
Yeah.
So it is really hard. It still is.
Describe for me the best day you had during your Vietnam tour.
Yeah, I think it was, we were on a company operation, just kind of patrolling through our tactical area responsibility (TAOR), and we had 2 tanks with us, and we'd been out for several days, and it wasn't like the war you guys were fighting down south where you were in pitched battles with the NVA. It also wasn't like the war the 3rd Division was fighting up north, where they were fighting regiments trying to come across the DMZ. If we saw a battalion, it was a huge deal. In most cases, we were dealing with,
local VC.
Squads of local VC, yes. But we were on a company sweep, and we had these 2 tanks operating with us, so we had to kind of be careful of where we went. And they were a great asset, and they definitely cleared the way. But anyway, we needed to get resupplied. We needed ammo, water, food. And a helicopter came in and dropped these cargo nets down, and they were big crates that I recognized as being napalm crates or canisters, and one of them was actually a napalm canister. And I thought, what in God's name do these guys think we're doing out here? So somebody opened it up, and the other thing was there was a bunch of 175 canisters, the big steel casings that the shells are shipped in.
Yeah.
And I was about to get on the radio and start screaming at the pilot and saying, "What do you think you're doing?" And somebody opened it up, and the napalm canister was full of ice and ice cream.
Whoa. And
the 175 canisters were full of water. And so, I mean, those guys were all heroes, and they dropped this like a case of bread right out of the bakery, you know, back in Da Nang, which there was no way we could eat it all. And there was cans, the great big 46-ounce cans of orange juice.
Wow.
It was all spectacular, but it was way more than we could consume, and we couldn't leave it behind. So I literally had the tanks drive back and forth over the bread to crush it. Yeah. So.
It was amazing what they could sometimes deliver in the field.
It is. It was. We had a supply sergeant, a kid named Corporal Moon, who was, the term is scrounge.
Oh, yeah.
They could find anything. And I somehow got a case of grapefruit sections once, and I was eating these grapefruit sections, and I called it the grapefruit diet. And for some reason, they just tasted really good. And he came down, racing down on his Jeep one time, saying, you know, I found it. And he thought he had grapefruit sections, and it was cans of grapefruit juice. So, there were a lot of really good times mixed into some pretty ugly things.
Describe for me the worst day you had during your tour.
I think it's probably a toss-up between finding out Bill was killed and getting shot myself. While I was on my extension, I was the group security officer at the wing headquarters in Da Nang at the airfield on the Marine Corps side of the air base in Da Nang, which was the busiest airport in the world at that time. And I had MPs whose job it was to, you know, guard the gates and pull colors, raise and lower the flag every day. And one morning, and I can remember this stuff like it was yesterday. A kid named Private Thomas E. Frazier was part of the color detail, and they came back in from pulling colors at the same time the corporal of the guards were changing. And the corporal of the guard had been out in the Ville earlier to pick up a prisoner or something, and so he had his .45 and he had put a round in the chamber. And so he made the mistake, which you can make with a .45, of taking out the magazine.
Thinking it was empty.
Pulling the slide to the rear and letting it go and going like this and pulling the trigger just as the private walked past the guard desk and put the round right through his head.
Oh.
And, you know, it's one of those things that I can't imagine what that kid lives with every day, knowing what he did. It was a terrible accident. There was nothing he could do. His parents, I've got a letter from his folks, you know, saying they understood and all of those things. But it just, you know, anytime you're in a wartime situation, things like that are going to happen, and they're just really sad.
Yeah. How much contact did you have with our allies, the Koreans, the Aussies, the New Zealanders, the Filipinos, the Thais?
Good question. I really didn't have any contact with, other than the Vietnamese, with anyone except a ROK Marine captain, a Republic of Korean captain in the Marine Corps, who was the liaison officer to the division when I was there. And he was one of those tough as nails guys, just exactly like, you know, that the ROK Marines are. When we were going through basic school, we had six Vietnamese Marines with us in our basic school company. Now these are guys who had spent their lives growing up in the war.
Yeah.
And had been through all their officer training there, but we brought them back to go through our basic school with us to see what it was like. And we had a Vietnamese roommate. There were two of us and Vietnamese gentleman named Nguyen Cao Niem. And we tried to show him America, and he would always complain about running. Why do we have to run all the time? This is so bad. We don't have to. You don't have to run in Vietnam. You know, it's too hot to run.
If someone's chasing
That's right.
you.
Exactly.
What was your opinion of the South Vietnamese troops?
You know, I think Nguyen was a good example in that, I mean, he was really tired of this war. I mean, we thought when we went there for a year, some people went back for 2 or 3 tours, that, you know, this was just exhausting. And the current war against terror, where we've been fighting for 10 years. But these people have been fighting their entire lives. Their entire lives.
Their lives.
And so, you know, there were some great, courageous Vietnamese Army and Marines that I met, and there were others who had been conscripted into the service and, you know, didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Didn't care, didn't want to.
Exactly, and couldn't be depended on in some cases.
Yeah. How much contact did you have with your family back home?
I don't think I ever made a Mars call. There was a thing called military affiliated radio system, which still exists today, that you could make a call back to the States, and then a ham radio operator would connect you with your parents. And I might have done that once after I got back on my extension.
Love you, Mom, over.
Yes, exactly. You had to say over after everything, and it was really hard for your parents to understand that and pick it up. But we wrote back and forth. My mother saved all my letters, and I still have them, and I've used them when I was taking a college course, actually. And I made a lot of tapes that I sent home, which they also saved. And some of them we actually made out in the bush when we were set in someplace. And the kid who was my FAC, my forward air controller, young Lance Corporal Rick Mahoney, took the tape recorder one time while we were in this fortified position, and we're set in, we're perfectly safe, but some guy was taking pot shots at us. And Mahoney would be running around interviewing people as they were shooting, and I never forget the kid was saying, "I found a blooper," and he was shooting the M79 grenade launcher, which is a weapon I really loved. I wish today I had one, actually, just to have it, because it was the squad leader's artillery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
How much news did you receive about the war from home? Stars, Stripes, magazines, clippings from your mom?
Yeah, not a lot. I think when you're out in the bush, or even when you're in the battalion rear. I mean, we did get Armed Forces Vietnam radio, but you never had that out in the field. Like I think maybe in some cases they do today. But so it was when you were back in the rear, you had a chance to interact, and you got news and stuff. The one news thing that I remember, I'll never forget, and when I got home and Watergate broke, it changed my impression, I guess, of then President Nixon. But I can remember being in Da Nang at the group headquarters compound as a security officer, and there was some interview that he was doing with someone, and there was a quote in which he said, "When the action is hot, keep the rhetoric cool." And that struck me for some reason. It just kind of stuck in my mind. I'm thinking, okay, that's what you're thinking back there, but it's hot over here, you know? And then when Watergate broke and I found out all the political stuff that had gone on behind the scenes, and you know how maybe we got sold down the river, I haven't forgiven him for that, but I still remember that quote. That was the big news piece that stuck in my mind.
Were you aware of any particular political or social events or movements going on back home?
We knew. I mean, I was there until I came home in July of '70, and I had that 30 days leave when I came home during my extension after my cousin was killed. So I saw a lot of it then. And when I came home in July of '70, it was kind of seeing for real what you had heard while you were over there. And as I recall now, it was like those people just do not get this. They don't understand. And if they would just write their congressman and say, let them do their job and get this over with, that would have been the best way to handle it, I think, from our perspective.
When did you return home?
It was July of 1970.
Tell me about what that was like.
I flew into El Toro, the Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro, and I can remember a couple things. One, when we were going through the customs inspection, there was a young man in front of me who had a bandolier in his ditty bag, in his sort of his gym bag. And they pulled out this bandolier, which obviously didn't have ammunition in it, and it was packed full of marijuana. And he immediately got taken off into a back room someplace, never saw him again.
Never saw him again.
No. And I at one point in Vietnam, I got the possession of a carbine, an old M1 carbine with a sawed-off handle. And I wanted so badly to bring that home, the 2 times that I actually came home. And I was always afraid of what would happen if I got caught with it. I just decided I wasn't going to do it, and I gave it to somebody. And the first time I came home on leave, I just kind of breezed right through, and I thought, God, I could have brought that rifle with me. The second time, that kid taught me, no, I did not want to do that. So
he tore your baggage apart.
Yeah, so that was one thing, and the other thing was that I was picked up by one of the guys who was in my basic school class, who was there at El Toro, and I stayed with him for a couple of days to kind of get decompressed. And we went to Disneyland. So I mean, I was probably 3 days out of, because you went from Vietnam to Okinawa, and then from Okinawa home. And I think we might have stopped in Hawaii to refuel. And the next thing I knew, I was in Disneyland.
Yeah, you and Mickey Mouse.
It was just so incongruous, such a big shock. It was really kind of bizarre.
Yeah.
But there were people at the gates at El Toro when we drove out protesting and spitting on the car and throwing stuff at you. And, you know, it was exactly the way I think it's kind of portrayed now, is people who didn't really understand our commitment, the country's commitment, maybe I should say the government's commitment, and the military's commitment to doing our jobs. And that's kind of what's scaring me now, I think, as we're getting into that same kind of situation, that we grow tired.
You went home to the East Coast from El Toro?
I did. I
Tell
flew
me
home.
about that homecoming.
You know, I can't remember which one was which, but I think that was the one. In fact, I know that was the one. I knew I was home for good, and I didn't tell my folks that I was coming. And so I was able to arrive at the front door and kind of push the front door in and surprise the heck out of everybody. And my mother maybe still hasn't forgiven me to this day. She was probably close to a heart attack.
Oh, dear.
But it was, you know, it was great to be home and great to see your family again. Today, one of the things that I work hardest at is trying to help guys who are coming home now. And at job fairs and all these things, it's just so hard to imagine what it's like to have multiple deployments, 6 months, a year at a time, where you're leaving your family, and some of these guys have done it 3, 4, 5 times.
6, 7, 8 times.
Exactly. It really is gut-wrenching, especially when there are kids involved. It's really hard on the spouse. We can't do enough to help our servicemen and women now and their families.
Did you have any difficulty readjusting to life after the combat tour?
You know, I think because I stayed in the Marine Corps, it was much easier for me. I was at Marine Barracks at Fort Meade as a guard officer at the National Security Agency. I sort of saw then another backside of the war, processing the intelligence and that kind of stuff that was going on. So I think that's one of the reasons why I didn't have a difficult time adjusting. I know people who have had. I remember a guy who lived in his mother's garage just down the street from us in Kirkland, who every day, his whole day was spent walking out of that garage, going up to the Zip Mart and buying a pack of cigarettes and smoking them on the way back, and then walking up and buying another one in an old, crusty field jacket. And I used to think when I'd drive by him on my way to work, there, but for the grace of God go I. Why did he end up that way and I am, a productive citizen? The thing I think that's a myth right now is that that people still think that so many of us, you and I, are messed up, and the reality is that's a very small portion of the Vietnam veterans.
I wonder about the new crop, though, and how bad we're going to have to face.
I think it's the same thing. It's still just a percentage, a small percentage. It's an important percentage, and it's something we have to focus on. But I've been at a job fair where you'll have 500 people, going to various booths trying to find a job, and you can tell when you get the guys who are still in the Wounded Warrior Regiment or the Warrior Transition Battalion, they call it, at Joint Base Lewis McChord, that are still zoned out. Yeah. They walk in with that 1,000-yard stare that our parents saw in World War II in Korea, yeah, and that we saw in Vietnam.
Absolutely.
And you want to stand up and hug the guy and say, "Son, I know that we're not going to be able to find you a job right now because you still have to get your head right. You need to stick with the VA. You need to keep working. You need to get training and get over this."
Yeah.
So it's tough.
It's amazing when you see that old man eyes in a young face.
Exactly. It's there, and it's been there probably every war since the beginning of time.
Is there any memory or experience from your time in Vietnam that has stayed with you through the years and had a lasting influence on your life?
I think an awful lot of all of our Vietnam experiences stayed with us. I think it's probably more so with today's veterans because they have so much more access to media and video and those kinds of things that they bring back with them. But I think your generation, our generation, I think, still had enough of those tools, and 40 years it's still fresh enough, and a lot of us came home like Carl Merlantis, who wrote his book Matterhorn. It took him, what did he say, 20 years to write it the first time, and he threw it away and finally got it right. I think a lot of that's been recorded and in our memories. So there are an awful lot of them there with me, but I said before, to me it's, why am I still alive? There's a reason why I'm here. And I mentioned before we started, I got involved in the Perot campaign when that happened, and maybe I thought at the time, well, maybe this is why I'm here. It turned out not to be exactly the case. And sometimes you interact with a young person. There are kids that I've helped, their parents understand them going into the Marine Corps. Maybe that's the reason. It's hard to put your finger on it, but I keep searching for that answer.
Yeah. Did your experience in Vietnam affect the way you think about the veterans coming home from combat today? Obviously you...
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm part of the Marine Corps support group here in Washington State that supports the Marine, the active duty and reserve Marines here in the area and all the veterans. I'm also a member of the Marine Corps League Detachment here, and we do everything we can not to let those men and women who are coming home today go through what you and I went through. And I think society gets that, there is absolutely no, well, I can't say none, but there's very, very little of the rejection and ridicule. But most of it's just kind of ambivalence.
Yeah.
Is it, the commandant used to say, the Marines are at war and America's at the mall.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. 1% are protecting 99%.
That's
and the 99% just don't know.
Yep.
Don't get it.
That's true. I'm hoping that your work, all the stuff that you've done, maybe helps people see that.
We
when
hope.
they watch something like this. Yeah.
We're hot at it here.
Yes, sir.
How do you think the Vietnam War is remembered today in our society, if it is?
I think my younger sister, not the youngest, but the second youngest sister, has a daughter who asked me probably 10 years ago when she was graduating from high school, I'm guessing, to interview me on the phone and talk about Vietnam. And I sent her a bunch of stuff that I'd written while I was in college after I came home. I think that generation remembers Vietnam because they kind of lived it with us, or their parents lived it with us. I think it's waning. My great-grandson right now that we help take care of, I doubt it will be anything to him. It might be because there's a veteran in the family, but I think for the most part that will just be something in the history books that they won't know about.
Did you take away from Vietnam more that was positive and useful than you invested in blood, sweat, and tears?
I think absolutely. I again consider myself very fortunate not just to have survived, but to have learned positive lessons and learned, about the courage of so many young men and women who also served there. So I believe that I got a much more positive impression out of it than negative.
What lessons did you take from Vietnam you'd like to pass on to future generations?
I've taught this in college when I taught NROTC students, and every chance I get, every time the word comes up, when people start talking about management and management training, I always make the point that there is a distinct difference between management of resources, one of which is people, and leadership of a company or a group, an organization. And I really think that that's a lesson I learned in the service, I learned in Vietnam, that more Americans need to come to grips with, is that you have to lead people to get things done. And if I have any regrets, it's that I don't do a better job sometimes of being a leader in things I'm involved in.
You stayed in the Marine Corps.
I did.
For 20 plus years.
I did. I enjoyed what I was doing. I got a chance to go some incredible places. I spent 3 years in Norway during the Reagan defense build-up years. We say that we take credit for breaking the Russians back when we put the Marine Brigade's equipment into the caves in Norway. And I spent my last year in Hawaii. I got to go to Australia. I spent a month with a rifle company in Vieques, Puerto Rico, once upon a time. It rained more there that month than in the entire history of the weather service in Puerto Rico. But just an incredible time. The Marine Corps, everything I am today, there's no question about it. My parents get a lot of credit for it, but the Marine Corps gets a huge amount of that credit for making me what I am.
Have you visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in D.C.?
Many times. And
What are your impressions when you go there?
I'm always moved by it. I love going back there. I've got a copy of the book, you know, for anybody who's interested. The Vietnam Veterans, I guess, Memorial Association puts out a booklet. It's about this thick that has every name and all the information. It's cross-referenced in various ways. I've got a copy of that. I've been through it and marked out the people who were killed while I was there. It's a very moving experience, and I think the only thing now for me that probably equals or exceeds that when I go back east is to go to the National Museum of the Marine Corps at Quantico. Is an unbelievable experience.
I haven't seen that yet, and I've got to.
You need to go, because I don't know if you were ever at Quezon, but
yeah,
in the Vietnam exhibit, you walk into the front end of an entrance, and you realize you're inside a CH-46 helicopter, the Frog, we call it. They just retired it. The 2 rotors like the Army 47, and it's vibrating. And it's making all the noises that a 47 makes.
Has it got hydraulic fluid dripping?
Dripping on the floor. And so then you walk out the ramp onto what I think is Hill 881. I wasn't up north, but there's a mortar pit there, an 81 mortar pit, and a chaplain who's getting ready to put a casualty on the bird.
Wow.
And you are right there, and it's so incredible. They've done a fantastic job.
I got to see that.
You need to.
I got to see that.
Definitely.
If that was a CH-34 shuttering shithouse, I would really be thrown back.
So you were in you flew in 34s as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
See, I spent my first 7 months with the Marines.
Right.
And right after the 1st Battalion landed at Da Nang.
65.
So it's 50 years ago this month that I landed there. Incredible.
I don't want this to end without my getting a chance to say this. Thank you for everything you've done for us, for all of us. Not just for what you went through in Vietnam, but what you've done since. We really appreciate it.
My honor and my pleasure. Got to stand with you then and get to stand with you now. Ain't giving up until we're dead.
Appreciate that. Me too.
Have you heard about the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War Commemoration Project?
I have several times.
What are your thoughts about that?
You know, I think it's a great idea. I think it, as we talked a little earlier, it helps kind of people who are kind of clueless about it get exposed to it and get some of the feel for it. I think it's done a lot for both current veterans and the Vietnam veterans. They did a massing of the colors down at Joint Base Lewis McChord, which I wasn't able to go to back in October, I think. And I think the more we can do in this 10-year period, I think the better off it'll be for the country, because there are still a lot of people who need to heal.
That 10 years down the road, there won't be many of us left.
No, that's true.
We're going out of the game fast.
Yeah, our company reunions, Kilo 31 reunions that we go to every other year are becoming, we're finding more and more people, but then there's less and less of them available too.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Doyne.
Thank you, Joe.
We appreciate your contribution here.
Well, I'm proud to do this. I thank you for letting me participate. It's fun to relive it.
Yeah.